So I'm Jessica. Thank you for coming. If you have any questions at all, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes afterward to answer them, either about this class, any of my other classes, or about my new 3-month program, the Conclave. So with that, we'll get started. I might use props. If you don't have them, do the best you can. If you're like, I wonder what I could use instead, again, unmute yourselves, ask, and I'll try to give you some suggestions. So we're going to start with some myofascial work with a peanut. You could also use a lacrosse ball. If you don't have a lacrosse ball, you could use a foam roller. And I begin most of my classes like this for the first 5 minutes. It's help calming the nervous system. The peanut is going right underneath your shoulder blades, and you're lying back on top of your yoga block. Hands behind the head, elbows scooping forward to create space between your shoulder blades. Inhale and arch back. Exhale, close the ribs, push through the feet and lift the pelvis. Inhale and arch. Exhale and curl. We'll stay here for 5 reps. And then we'll move the peanut slightly higher. So now it's more in between the shoulder blades. Again, elbows scooping forward to create space between the shoulder blades. Inhale and arch. Exhale and curl, pushing through the feet and lifting the pelvis. We'll move the block away. Move the block away, and now we're going to bring the peanut to the side butt area. So lying on your side, peanut is underneath your hip in that meaty area, and we're rolling back and forth on the peanut. Again, you could easily do this with a foam roller. And then pause on a sensitive spot. And then we're going to bring the knee in toward the chest, internally rotate and extend out. And then roll back and forth again. Find a second sensitive spot, hold it there. Bring the knee in toward the chest again, about 4 inches off the ground. And we're going to tap the toe down to the ground and lift the heel up. Then we're going to move the peanut to the TFL. So to find your TFL, we have our hip bone, and we're going straight down, but slightly to the outside. So lying down on your side, but rolling forward into the peanut and rolling back and forth. Hold it in a place that feels sensitive, and then just rock your hips forward and back. And then move the peanut to the top of the quad and roll over so your hips are square to the ground, tucking your toes, and use your toes to just push you forward and back. Hold it on the sensitive spot. Then we're going to lift that heel up off of the ground 10 times. And then we'll start that whole series over again on the other side, starting at the side butt. Very specific name. Rolling back and forth. Pausing on that first sensitive spot, bringing the knee in, internally rotating and extending. Rolling back and forth again. Finding that second sensitive spot, bringing the knee in, raising it up off the ground, tapping the toe and lifting the heel. And then moving the peanut to the TFL, rolling slightly forward so you're half in between on your side and on your stomach, and rolling back and forth. And then moving to the top of the quad, tucking the toes, squaring the hips to the ground, and rolling up and down. And then lifting that heel up 10 times. And then we're going to move to the adductor. So inner thigh starting close to the groin, halfway down, and then right above the knee. If your hips are really open, you could be flat on the ground. If you need a little extra pressure, you can use your yoga block. So your hips are going to face the ground. You're coming to a half frog position. Put pressure into the peanut, and then we're extending the knee and bending it. Just 5 times. And then moving it halfway down. 5 more. And then right above the knee. And then switching to the other side. Same thing. Starting by the groin. 5 extensions. You can be in flex or point here, whichever feels better. Halfway down. And right above the knee. And then we're going to sit on the ball on one butt cheek. And then cross that same side over into a figure four. You're leaning into the ball slightly. Again, this one's really easy to do with a foam roller as well. And we're just rolling back and forth. Think about pressing that knee away from you the whole time. And then switch to the other side. Into the glute max, that high part of the butt, closer to your back. All right, you can put the peanut ball to the side. I'm just gonna lie on your back and bring one knee into your chest. The other foot is just on the ground. We're gonna keep the knee tight into your chest, pointing your foot, extending the knee until you reach that little bit of a shaking feeling. Flex the foot and bend the knee. Point, extend, flex, and down. In our sciatic nerve glides, we're trying to go to that point of nerve tension and then backing off of it. And we're doing about 10. And then switching to the other side. Again, knee tight into your chest. Try to not let the knee move. It's perfectly fine if your knee doesn't extend all the way. And then we're going to take that knee and bring it slightly across to the opposite shoulder and do 10 more exactly the same way. You may feel a little more nervy on the outside of the leg as you bring the knee across. And then switch to the other side. Bring the knee across, bend and extend. You come to a tabletop position and get the spine moving. If the spine is not articulating, then the hips don't want to move as well. So we're starting in a neutral position. Go ahead and let the sits bones lift and the sternum lift into your arch. And tuck your toes under. Let your hips sink back toward your heels, but not touching the heels with your butt. Again, pulling your chest through your arms. And then rock your weight forward onto your hands. Untuck your toes. Curl your pelvis. Let the curl ripple through the spine and let your hips sink back toward your heels without touching them. Shift your weight forward, tuck your toes, come into your arch and sink your weight back. Shift your weight forward, untuck your toes, curl your pelvis and sink your weight back. Just moving back and forth between cat-cow, but thinking more about the articulation. In the arch, we're moving into the upper back. In the curl, we're moving into the low back. On your curl, go ahead and sit back on your heels and reach your hands forward, wrapping around your armpits, pushing down into the ground and breathing into the back of the ribs. Walk your hands over to the right, wrap around that left armpit a little bit more and push into the ground, and shift your weight a little over to the left to get a stretch in that left lat. The lats run all the way down the body, which means, again, lat tightness is going to impact your hip movement. And then walk your hands through the center over to the left, wrapping more through that right side, pushing your weight over to the right, getting into the right lat. All right, and then we'll come up to seated figure 4. Hands slightly, maybe a foot or two away from your hips, so there's some space there. So crossing over, your knee is pushing away from your body, and you're going to pull into an arch. So sits bones are lifted and sternum is lifted. And then you're going to move into your curl. We're going to go through lots of arches and curls, curling the pelvis and the low back, still pushing your knee away from you. Moving between arch and curl. On your next arch, walk your hands in close to your hips. Keep pushing that knee away from you. And then just shift your hips side to side. And then you're going to take your top foot and drop it down to the ground. You'll be in this pretzel position. Hug your top knee. And if your right leg is crossed over your left shoulder is going down toward the ground, or vice versa. In this position, we're thinking about trying to pull into the arch. Again, sits bones lifted, sternum lifted. The more opposition you have between your sits bones and your sternum, the more stable you'll feel here. And then come back to upright, lean back, and switch your legs. Going back to your arch and curl, top knee pushing away from you the whole time. Hold it in your arch. Walk your hands in, shift your hips side to side. Drop your top foot down, hug your leg, and opposite shoulder reaches down toward the ground, finding your arch. Back to upright. Windshield wiper your legs side to side, finding that internal rotation from the hip. And then we're going to come to a double pigeon position. So 90-degree angle in the knees, shins stacked on each other. Top foot is past your knee, but not too far past. Just enough that it's comfortable and that that ankle bone isn't going straight into your leg. From here, we're going to think about the knee pushing in toward the ground, coming into your arch and leaning forward. Lean forward until you feel a light stretch, so nothing too extreme. You could be up here, you could be really far down, either is fine. And we're going to go back through our arch and curl. So as you arch, lifting the sternum, lifting the sits bones, pushing your knee down toward the ground. As you curl, we're going to push the bottom knee up toward the top one. Arch, top one pushes down, curl, bottom one pushes up. And then we'll hold it in our arch. If you can walk forward a little more, go ahead. And then we're going to bring the chest over one knee and then over the other one. We're trying to use the arms as little as possible here, maybe just on an extra spiral at each side. And then hold it in the center. Walk your hands as far as you can. And we'll take 3 deep breaths here, thinking about sinking deeper in every exhale. And we'll lean back, switch the legs. You can do a little windshield wiper here to reset the hips. And then we're over to the other side. Again, foot slightly past the knee. Start sitting up tall, sits bones, sternum lifted, leaning forward until you feel a light stretch and moving from your arch and curl. Arch, pushing the top leg down, curl, pushing the bottom leg up. Hold it in your arch, come forward a little bit more, and side to side. Hold at center, walk your hands farther forward, and 3 deep breaths, sinking in the exhale. Leaning back and windshield wipering the legs. We're going to hold it over to one side, and you can turn your hips a little bit until your knee hits the ground. Walk your hands in so your chest is a little more upright, and stick your butt out, again, lifting the sits bones and lifting the sternum. We're in that arch. And then think about trying to reconnect your sits bone back down to the ground. From there, push this knee into the ground and think about trying to lift your foot off of the ground. If you don't have a ton of internal rotation, nothing's going to happen. But we want that intention of internal rotation happening from the hip instead of torque in the knee. So we're just holding this isometrically for about 10 seconds. And then switching to the other side. Again, you can turn the hips as much as you need to get to the knee toward the ground. And then once it's there, then adjust your upper body to try to reconnect. Knee pushing into the ground, foot trying to lift off of it. Should feel this deep in the hip, not in the knee. And come on back. So from this really wide position with the legs, we're going to go back and forth again, like we're windshield wipering, except we're going to delay that second leg. So here, as I pull this knee out, I'm going to pull this one as wide as well. And then think about trying to connect to the ground with the other knee and keeping this one wide as long as possible and then letting it come back. The hips can move with you. We're trying to go wide as possible in between every rotation. All right, and then we're going to hold it in this 90-90 position on one side. You can grab a yoga block, which you may or may not need. So we're going to start just mobilizing this back hip. You can put your hand on the top of your hip, the thumb kind of wrapping around towards your gluteal fold, and think about this hip rotating in the socket into internal rotation and rotating back into external, letting the hips move with you. Feel how that under butt area helps you move more into your internal rotation. And as you come into external rotation, you might feel more of a stretch toward the inner thigh. We're going to hold it in neutral, so neither forward nor back. And we're going to take your block and put it under your front knee. The knee's pushing into the block, and we're going to try to lift the foot off of the ground 10 times. Again, you don't need the block here, but if I don't use it, nothing happens. And then we'll switch to the other side, our other 90. So 90-90 with the knees, mobilizing this back hip. Using that under butt area to push your hip forward. It's a squaring motion, like in your splits. And then we'll hold it in neutral. Block goes under that front knee. And we're lifting the foot off of the ground or pulsing up in a contraction if it doesn't lift 10 times. And then we're going to come into our straddle. We're going to go back to that arch and curl that we did in figure 4 and our double pigeon. So coming forward to wherever you feel a light stretch, you may feel it in your inner thighs or in your hamstrings. We want to contract the quads, so energy through the legs, either in point or flex. And think about the side butt working to open your legs wider. Knees stay pointed up toward the ceiling, moving through arch and curl. So curling into the low back, arching, lifting the sits bones and lifting the sternum. Hold it in your arch, maybe move a little bit closer to the ground. And the same motion with double pigeon, moving your chest over to one knee and over to the other. Feel the difference in your sides and notice if you have sticking places. Keep energy through the legs, and again, try to use your hands as little as possible. So wherever you noticed that sticky spot, I want you to pause in that spot. It's usually in a diagonal. And we're going to move through our arch and curl 4 times here. If you notice this arch and curl, it's also like a twerking motion. And the pubic bone is reaching toward the ground in your arch. Wherever you stopped on, do the equivalent space on the other side just to make sure you're even, and 4 arches and curls. Then come back to your center. Pull your pelvis slightly farther between your legs. And then we're going to take your hands off of the ground and we're just going to pulse up 10 times. And then come all the way up. So now we're going to work on that rotation that we were doing from our 90-90 position, but from straddle instead. So we're thinking about one leg moving into internal rotation as the other leg moves into external rotation. Depending on how open you are in center here, it may be something that you can do from here, or you might have to bend a knee, and that's perfectly fine, right? So if I'm moving over to the right, if my right knee bends, I can internally rotate my left, right? The internal rotation is super small. We're not trying to go all the way into a front split. We're just starting to mobilize that rotation. And I find it helpful sometimes to stay in flex because then you can actually see how much you're rotating and the difference in your sides. All right, let's move into the hamstrings just a little bit. So here you have choices about props. You could use a heavier mini band or you could use a stretching strap. I'm going to use a stretching strap. And if you don't have anything, that's fine. You can just lift your leg out to the side. We want it to be about forearm length. It could be a little bit longer than that. And you might want something to put your hands on. If you have your blocks ready, then you can adjust as needed. So the strap is going around your ankles. And we're coming into a forward fold with the hands on the ground or on an object. The goal here is to be able to lift the sits bones. So don't worry about trying to get farther down to the ground unless you can do that. You see here, I can't lift as much, so it's more productive for me to stay up just a little bit higher. Shift your weight forward so it's even between the balls of your feet and your heels. And then right here, we're just going to arch and curl the pelvis a few times. Every time you arch, think about your belly button reaching toward your thighs. And then we're going to shift your blocks over to one side or your hands so that they're in front of one leg. Shift your weight into that leg, and the other foot is going to come off of the ground. I'm just flexing so it can hover, but you could also point it if you can lift farther. And think about lifting your sits bones as much as you can and pushing into the strap or your band. We're just holding this position 10 seconds. And then switching to the other side, putting the foot down, switching your hands over, making sure your weight is even in the balls and the heel of your foot. Coming into your arch, shifting your weight and lifting the foot off of the ground. And release. We're going to stick with your blocks, and we're going to move them out to put your knees on top of in a frog position. If you are hypermobile, I'm going to give some cueing that is talking about making sure you're in an anterior pelvic tilt. But if you are completely open at 180 and you have hypermobile joints, you don't want to be in an extreme anterior pelvic tilt at your end range. The hip bone, the head of the femur is just hitting into the hip socket. We don't want that. You're going to keep more of a neutral or even more of a curled position. And I'll show you both of those. So your knees are up on your blocks and your feet are in line with your knees. You're coming down onto your elbows. And we're going to go into a slight curl in the pelvis. And then rock your hips forward in front of your knees and back behind your knees. Right now, we're just mobilizing the hips. This isn't really any sort of stretch muscularly. We're just moving through a range. And then we're going to hold it where your hips are slightly behind your knees. So here, for most people, we're going to go into an anterior pelvic tilt and hold this position. Think about your knees trying to lift off of the blocks and sinking your hips deeper. And again, if you are hypermobile here and at your 180, we're going to curl the pelvis and do the same thing. And then from this position, you're going to take one knee and we're going to push it into the block instead of trying to lift off, but we're going to lift the heel off of the ground and pulsing up 10 times. And then switching to the other side. And then we're going to hold both of them off of the ground. If this feels like enough of a stretch, you can leave it here. If you want to increase it, you can come up onto your hands and shift your weight back a little bit. We're still keeping it active by lifting the heels up off of the ground. And lower down, bring your feet together, and then you can come up off the blocks and have a little bit of a walk to reset the hips. And then we'll come back to our seated pancake straddle position. And now we're going to focus on that feeling of moving between our pancake and our middle split. If you have the mobility to roll through, you can. But if you don't, that's not where we're trying to go, right? So when we're moving between these two positions, the initiation of the movement is really the most important part, because we're going from as wide as we can actively pull our legs, right, to a more passive position as we roll through. So we're working on actively trying to get there instead of just letting gravity push us to the ground, which can be unsafe, and the nervous system really freaks out and just likes to close up and can be really unproductive. So we're staying in a productive range. So if you start with your knees facing up, we did the exercise where we were focusing on rotation one leg at a time. Now we're trying to rotate both legs at the same time while anteriorly tilting the pelvis and thinking about the pubic bone going toward the ground. So if you start in your widest position, bring your hands forward. We're going to arch the pelvis and roll the knees forward at the same time. This can be a really small motion. And then pull it back. So we're going to take our yoga blocks and they're going to go underneath your knees in this flying spider position. We want the knees as wide as they can possibly be. And then we're bringing the chest down between the knees. Again, we're arching the pelvis and we're lifting the sits bone. I said the wrong thing. We're lifting the sits bones and lifting the sternum. Like, this is not the pelvis. So knees are pointed up toward the ceiling, big arch. This is a counterbalance, so we want to get the chest as low as we can. Straighten the knees and push into the blocks to lift your pelvis off the ground. If the pelvis is lifted, then keep the legs really straight and let the hips sink back down toward the ground as far as they can without touching. Right, so this is our flying pancake position. From here, if you let your heels push down toward the ground and bring your upper body up, we're in our straddle split. So we can move back and forth between pancake and straddle. And bring your legs back together, shake them out a little bit. And then let's go into a psoas stretch. If you need something to place your knee on that's more comfortable. So we're going to go into a lunge. I want you to choose a position that is kind of your medium lunge, right? We could be hips stacked directly over that back knee. You could be lunged all the way down. Pick a place right in the middle. And we're going to do that same feeling with that back leg, where we're externally rotating and internally rotating, letting the hips move with you. Feel how, as you go into internal rotation, if you squeeze your inner thighs together, you can get a little bit more squaring. Then hold it in that squared position. Think about your belly button moving back away from your front thigh, trying to curl the lower back just a little bit. The ribs are going to close. The chin is going to come down into the chest. And think about this underbutt area of the back leg moving forward. Then release that big contraction and let the hips sink down farther, but don't lose that internal rotation of the back leg. From here, think about, again, your hips moving forward, so the underbutt pushing that hip open. Think about a slight curl of the pelvis. Again, that's going to bring the belly button away from the thigh. And then from here, try to bend your back leg 5 times. Like half is cramping, so I'm not going to point. And then come to upright, and we'll switch to the other side. I always forget to warm up my calves, and then they tell me I forgot. So again, we're starting at our medium lunge, in between, and we're working on rotation in that back leg. We want to make sure also that that back foot is in line with the knee, that it's not in. It's a little out, that's okay. And then hold it in your internal rotation. Think about that hip moving forward. We're going to pull the belly button back into the spine, close the ribs, bring the chin down into the chest. Think about your inner thighs squeezing together. And then sink the hips down farther. You can slide that front foot out if you need to. Then we're going to slightly curl the pelvis. It's going to bring the stretch all to that back leg. Close the ribs slightly, and then thinking about bringing the back leg up. And then again, taking a little walk to reset the hips. So here we're going to go into some slide outs. You can use a foam roller, or you could use your foot on a wood floor. The foam roller is going to give you a little extra lift. So depending on your range, it can be helpful. Oftentimes your back knee is kind of what holds you back in your front splits. It touches the ground. So a little lift on that front foot can sometimes be helpful. And you will want some sort of padding for that back knee. Mine's always sensitive. Perfectly okay to hold on to some yoga blocks if you need them. You won't use them in the beginning, but as you slide down, you'll find stability with the floor. So we're going to start in this runner stretch position, hips over the back knee. Front leg is straight and the hip is down. So think of the head of the femur pulling back into the hip socket. And then your inner thighs squeezing together slightly to keep that squaring action. We're going to slide out. We're starting with the roller right in your arch. We're going to slide out and pull back. This motion is happening mostly from the back hip, right? So the back hip is pushing forward to open this back hip. And then it's pulling from the quad up to pull you back. We're just going to do 5 here, going a little deeper each time. Falling off of the roller. And then switching to the other side. Again, making sure this hip stays down. And then we're going to focus on that back leg just a little bit more. So we're going to use blocks under the front knee. This low medium setting works pretty well if you have your front splits or you're an inch or 2 off the ground. If you're more than that, then generally you're going to need 2 blocks and 1 on top. So you're going to go into your deep lunge and slide the blocks in front of, underneath that knee. Then we're focused on bringing this back hip into our internal rotation. I'm going to tuck the back toe. Think about curling the pelvis slightly to bring the stretch to the back leg. You can bring your hands onto your front blocks. Make sure this knee is actually resting on the blocks, not hovering off. And then stretching through the back leg, tapping 5 times. I'm just checking the comment. We want to make sure here that we are feeling the stretch in the back hip. So both in the psoas and in the quad, not in the low back. If you feel this in your low back, think more about beginning to curl the pelvis and closing the ribs so the spine comes out of an arch and more into a neutral position. And then switching to the other side. This is my goofy side. Tucking that toe and straightening the leg. All right, this is the time of the class where you're really ready to go into your splits. And I would say let's go into your front splits and pay attention to what your body is telling you, right? Usually the first place you feel it, the first time you're going into your front split for the day, is the place that just needs a little more work before you try to go deeper. So we've done a ton of work in opening up, I would say everything except for your hamstrings. And the reason that I often in an hour class give hamstrings the shorter shrift is because it's usually not where people need the most work. They need more work in the back hip. That's what's being left out. That's why we have hamstring injuries, because the back hip isn't open enough and it forces everything to go into the front hamstring. So if you go into your front split here and you're like, well, Jessica, I feel it in my hamstring, look at the position of your pelvis. Usually that's because you're in an anterior tilt and you're leaning forward, and suddenly you have your leg at an angle that's above your end range. So here, just sliding into your front split and thinking about our cues, right? This back hip pulling forward and then curling the pelvis slightly. Just doing that little arch and curl, you'll feel the difference in the motion in how it feels in your hamstring. And that just lets you know you can control that sensation. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, but I'm going to stick around. So if you have any questions or you want me to look at something, that is cool too.